on page Vov, is that correct? How what you have? Okay, let me start this. I can tell if it started. Okay. Uh, okay. We try to explain the principle of what's called Ila v'Olu. You have notes on that? Ila v'Olu?
Nope. From last year?
Yeah.
You still with Ila also?
Yeah. Explaining it from Ila v'Olu. Can you say something on that?
Abba Paltiel last year.
You were here by last year.
Yes.
Can you say something about Ila v'Olu? I mean, just a basic point.
So we're talking about.
This is not a test.
Yeah. That the cause, the true cause, has an essential level. That's not found in the effect. The cause is a true initiator. Even when the cause is not being even when there's no effect, even when there's no action, it's still there. Like you can still call it by that.
All right. And okay. And the Olul, what is that's the Ila. And the Olul, anything on that score?
It's a little broad. It's always still to go back to the real, but to its cause, because that's what its real distance is. Otherwise, it doesn't have. It's just mechanical action. Otherwise, it doesn't have any truth to itself, and that's why it's always look backwards to the cause, because the cause has this level of this effect being bekoyer, meaning existing without needing to be acted out. And the fact when it's once acted out, the fact always wants to have it always has to have a connection to the
Right. Okay, so, all right. So let me just refresh. That's good, at least, you know. We are now, the Rebbe is now going to into this path of explaining this broad principle that we discussed in the last several pages. That something that in Dibur, for instance, if the Seichel comes down in Dibur, even though it's a lessening of the Oyer HaSeichel, and yet there's a special quality to it, there's a special power in Dibur, that it can actually increase the Seichel, broaden it out and get into a level of depth that with Machshava alone you wouldn't be able to get to. So to explain this, he went into this very broad discussion when he says that there's a general question. Before we get to the answer to the answer, this is going to be a long process. Because and the start of this process is that there is a general question: how does it happen that oil should come down? To phrase this more at our level, in our orientation, how does it happen that one understands a seichel, and he's involved in the seichel in his machshava, and then he goes and speaks it out. He speaks on it. Speaking on that seichel is lessening the oir, and the oir, the dibur comes from the machshava. So how does it come about that this oir haseichel from the machshava should come down in dibur, where the machshava is the source of this dibur, and machshava is that which gives it real substance. So therefore, he should want always to rise back into machshava, not to be in the dibur. This is just an illustration of the general topic. How is it that oil comes down and comes down? In order to explain this question on a more fundamental level, not just in illustrations, but in principles, the Rebbe goes into explaining the concept of ilu v'olu. Why ilu v'olu? Because the oil coming down from its source has a relationship of ilu v'olu. As I said, we're discussing now in very general terms on the principle level. The machshava and dibur is only an example, only an illustration of what we're discussing. And in principle, we have the following rules that are called, so to speak, logical rules. That ilu v'olu relate to one another. In contrast to a totally different process that's called yesh me'ayin. Yesh me'ayin means that the yesh, or the created entity, does not have the ability to recognize what it is that created it. Because the creator, the power of creation, is not within its realm of comprehension. That's why it's called ayin, because I have no way of defining it within the context of my existence.
Creator is not in the realm of the creator.
Creator is not in the realm of the created. And that's why the created cannot relate to the creator in the sense of, oh, I want to go back to the creator. He doesn't know what it is. And therefore the created kind of orients itself within its own world, because that's the only reality it recognizes. Its source is something which is distant. It cannot distant, not only distant in distance. It's something that it cannot have any touch, any comprehension of. Therefore, it cannot be said that it's drawn to its source. But ilu v'olu, in contrast, is different. That the olu does recognize the ilu, and does recognize the superiority, the richness of the ilu. And therefore, the olu naturally would be drawn back to the ilu, because that's what substantiates it. Throughout this discussion, we'll use this example of machshava and dibur, so we will be able to relate to what we're saying in general terms. When one explains a seichel, when you explain a seichel in dibur, even though you explain it logically and it makes sense within the context of the structure that you're explaining, the logical arguments, still what gives you reassurance that what you are saying has substance, what you are saying is true, is because in your machshava you understand it at a much richer level. The presentation in Dibur is only to be able to present it and to argue the case, but not that it gives that this is the only source of knowledge. This is the only thing that makes it true to you, because in machshava you understand it at a much higher and truer level.
Dibur is no source of knowledge.
Excuse me?
Dibur isn't a source of knowledge.
Well, if you have a logical presentation, it kind of can stand on its own.
Where is it coming from? It's not coming from its own.
No, it's not a question of where it's coming from. Where is the nivra come from? You said in contrast to nivra and boiri. Right? Where does the nivra come from? It doesn't come from its own. So the nivra also knows that he didn't create himself. Yet, even with this knowledge, he still has to relate to his own mitzias, because that's the only mitzias that he can relate to. He can relate to the mitzias, to the presence of the Creator. He can relate to the Creator in terms of avodah, but in terms of his personal presence, personal existence, that's it's a different realm of existence.
But Dibur is not like a human being. Dibur is Ilav Olu, right?
Is what?
Dibur is like Ilav Olu.
Oh, okay, so that's been saying. In contrast, Dibur is Ilav to Machshav. And therefore, even though Dibur, you can present a completely rational presentation, still you sense even a greater substantiation, a greater truth in this Dibur, because you also understand it at a higher level. Dibur is not separated from the Machshava. You understand it on a higher level. And if you understand on the higher level, you would tend to want to go back to that level rather than develop the presentation of the Dibur. So in other words, this is why we say that Ilov Olul, since that the Olul recognizes the Ilah and understands the Ilah, can relate to the Ilah, and he recognizes clearly that this is the Ilah for this Olam, which is his sword, this is the real substance of this Seichel. Therefore, naturally it should be the tendency that he would want to go back to the source, because that's where the real substance of this Inyan is. And this is the question that Rebbe is presenting. That it's a pella, that the oyer, and going back now to the principled terminology, the oyer should go downwards, since it senses its source and it recognizes its real source. Its tendency should have been only to go back to its source, because that's where its real substance is. Not to be where it's oyer, go back to its source, which is the moyer. You're talking about oyer in general.
No, but in this case,
In this case, in my illustration, I'm talking about the oyer HaSeichel.
so what Dibur has to do with it? Just,
The oyer HaSeichel comes down in Dibur.
no, but the illustration that you brought, the Dibur looking for substantiation in a Seichel.
I'm saying the oyer has in Dibur has oyer HaSeichel, as we discussed before.
Right.
So the oyer HaSeichel in Dibur is developed, right, to be developed at the level of Dibur. And the question is, how come? Why? Why would the Seichel want to go down into Dibur? He would want to go back to Machshava, because that's where its real substance is.
You can take it even further back. You can say, well, why does the Or Seichel want to go into Machshava? It can stay in the previous Ilu for that Olo, right? Why is this stop where you ask the question, well, why doesn't it want to stay back in its source when everything is Yerida from the Nefesh?
That's right.
So why is this the place where the Rebbe chose to ask this question? Since you can ask it on every descent from Nefesh into Chayach HaMaskal, however it goes down, You can ask the question at any one of the levels. So why does he ask it Dafka here?
Because here we need to get to understand a paradox. And the paradox is that in Dibur the Seichel increases. And the Seichel, you get into the depths of the Seichel.
Seichel doesn't increase in Bina?
When we're saying that after Bina and everything, when after you have Bina and you have Machshava and you understand it well, when you bring it out in Dibur, you first get to a deeper level in
My
the
question
Seichel.
is, doesn't Chachma, when it comes down to Bina, doesn't become expanded? Doesn't get
Yes.
added to it?
Yes.
So you're saying the reason you want to explain it because we specifically want to explain how Dibur expands the Machshava. But Bina does the same thing to Chachma as Dibur does to Bina.
Okay, but we are discussing Machshava with Dibur.
So
There is some similarity in this respect,
so what is it? I'm saying,
but
to
because we are discussing Dibur.
Right, but why specifically Dibur, not a level before that?
For the purposes that we will see because the creation is to Dibur, that for the purposes of the general Maimon that we're discussing.
So because of the paradox found in Dibur, that's why we're discussing this anomaly of the cause going away from the effect.
The effect going away from the cause.
The effect going away from the cause.
Right. Okay. Now, this is only kind of in the beginning of a kind of deviation. We're not going to come back with an answer instantaneously. We're going to discuss a very broad topic. And this broad topic will bring us back to understand deeply the concept of what we said before in Dibur and Machshava. Okay. So he says, first of all, he has the principle, Hamshochas ha'oir. Oir is always an inyan of ilo v'olo. What does this mean? Oir is always ilo v'olo. The definition of oir is that it's a reflection from its source. Oir is not a creation, like a nivra. A nivra is not ilav olam. A nivra does not recognize his creator, does not understand anything about the creator. Oir is a reflection of the source. And that's what the Rebbe says, that Oir is a ilav olul even at the very highest source. Not only Oir as it comes down, like we say, the Oir had Dibur coming down, Oir HaSeichel in Dibur, coming down from the Oir HaSeichel in Machshava and so forth. But even at its very inception, the Oir, Gam, K'mo Nimshech Me'hamoir, even the original inception of Oir, as the Oir comes from the Moir, where Oir and Moir are entirely two different inyonim. Moir is the source, is a giving off Oir, and Oir is only a reflection of the Moir, and only an expression of the Moir. But even then, it is an inyan of Ilav Olam. Okay? The principle, I mean, you have to try to understand the emphasis over here. Oir gang k'meshi nimshach min hamoir. As we said many times, the one direct illustration, moshel of Oir and Moir we have is the sun and its light. The sun is whatever its substance is, but it is a substance. This substance possesses the quality of oil in its very essence. It's not an add-on to it, but its very essence is bright. But its essence is not oil. Its essence is whatever it is, but in its essence there is the quality of brightness. Oil does not take anything of the essence of the sun. What does it take? The brightness aspect. So it is very different than moil.
Can you explain it again?
Yeah, I can explain, but I'd like you to pay attention.
I did pay attention.
Good.
So its essence is bright, well, the light is not in its essence bright?
No. The light is brightness, and the moil is, and the sun is brightness. But the sun is not, by definition, brightness. The sun in its substance is not brightness. It's made, whatever it's made up of. It's fire. But it's through and through whatever that substance is, and that substance in its very essence contains the inner brightness. It is bright in its very essence. In other words, brightness is not an add-on to the sun, but it is through and through brightness. Okay? Oil coming from the sun. You with me? Yeah. Oil coming from the sun. What aspect of the sun comes in the oil? The brightness aspect, not the essence, not the substance. Because if you took a piece of the substance of the sun, you wouldn't need to replenish it all the time. Oil needs to be replenished all the time from its source, which means that oil has only the brightness, not the substance, not what makes the sun bright. So therefore,
So the light is not brightness.
the light is brightness,
So what? So
but it's only brightness. It's not the substance that makes the sun bright.
it's an add-on to its substance is brightness.
Well, I avoid using the word add-on, although for the purposes of argument we can use add-on, but add-on is incorrect to say, because add-on means that you can have that substance without the brightness. But that's not so. That substance is brightness through and through. It's etzem behiri.
So its essence is brightness, why can't it shine on its own?
Wait a second. The oil? What are you talking about?
The oil.
No, the oil doesn't have a substance. The oil only has the brightness coming from the sun. It doesn't have substance of its own that makes light come out.
Right, that's it.
You understand? It's a reflection of the brightness of the sun. Okay? So therefore, when we say oil comes from the sun, it takes from the sun only its brightness quality, not its substance.
It's an extension of brightness quality, right?
What? Just a second, let me finish the... Okay? No, I understand, but it will be clear if you let me finish that. Okay? It takes only the brightness of the sun, not the substance of the sun. So since it doesn't take the substance of the sun, you may think to say that oil and moil are in two different categories. That oil does not relate directly to its source, because its source has the source of light. The oil does not have a source of light. It only has the light. This is what the Rebbe is saying. that even at the level when we talk about oil coming from the moir, means from the source of light, which is something else than light. Still, it is correct to say that oil is a yilov olol to the moir. In other words, it still can relate to the moir, because what aspect of the moir comes into the light, it is not the substance, but it is the brightness of it. And this brightness in the moir is different than it is in the light. What is the difference? In the light it is only light, the poil. In the source it is a source of light. It is that which makes brightness. So therefore, oir, if it should relate to the brightness of the sun, it should want to be in its source, because in the source the brightness has a substance, has a base for being bright, whereas the oil, as it is outside of the sun, does not have a base on its own.
You said I might think that they're disconnected.
Right. You may argue that they're disconnected. That's why the Rebbe says, why would you argue that they're disconnected? Because the oil does not take everything of the moir. Because the oil does not become a moir. It only reflects what's in the moir. It doesn't become a moir itself.
So how do we answer that?
We answer that it's true that it doesn't become a moir. It only takes from the moir the oil aspect. But this oil aspect in the moir is at a much higher, a much more essential state than it is in the oil. This is the source of the light.
So what does that make it one thing?
So therefore it means like this. The oil does have a comprehension in its source, because its source is the brightness of the moir, not the substance. And the brightness, the air recognizes the brightness because the oil itself is also brightness. But what kind of brightness is it in the moir? In the moir, the brightness is a much more substantial, much more truer brightness, because it has also a base, a source. And that's why the oil is ilov olul relative to the moir, and the oil should naturally have tended to stay in its source, because that's where its real quality is present and recognized.
But you're saying it should be disconnected because they're two different things at the end of the day. But the reason why they're disconnected is because the R is its entire existence is the Mar itself. It's not that it's a different reality from the Mar. It is the Mar, just it's a faint expression of it. So you're saying that I might think that it's two different things, but because they're different. The reason they're not different is because the Mar, everything in the R is the Mar, just in a limited.
Yeah, but that's true, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. Avram, you wanted to ask me something. I interrupted you. Are you with me? Huh?
Yeah.
Go ahead. What is it? What do you want to say?
No, I didn't hear you did. I want to ask you also when you were giving an answer for this question that you asked. When you said that we would like to ask that it's different things.
Right.
But it's not a different things. So you explained very quickly, and then you just didn't want to.
Okay. All right. Let me go back a little bit. I'm going to explain the following. The Rebbe says over here, if you go back 5 lines from the bottom, he says, Ki yodua dechol hamshochas oir, that all hamshocha of oir, gam k'mo shenimshach min hamoir, even as the oil comes from the moir, hu b'vchinas gilui ha'helem, it qualifies as gilui ha'helem, revealing that which was concealed, which means it's not a new creation, but just revealing that which was contained before. Shehu inyan ilav olu, which in general terms it's called ilav olu. Okay. What is the Rebbe saying here? That oir per se, anytime you say oir, you're talking about oir coming from the moir, oir coming from any place. If it's oir, it has the quality of ilav olu. And the Rebbe says that this is true, that oil qualifies as ilav olu, even at the point of the original inception point where the oil comes from the moir. That's what he says. And I'm explaining the general concept of ilav olu. I'm explaining why this is even. Now, what's the emphasis? What is the need for making the point that even when it comes from the moir, it's also ilav olu? So I explained like this, that if we take the light coming from the sun, okay, step back a second. Since that the Rebbe says, even when it comes from the moir, that means that we may have thought that the oil coming from the moir is not ilav olu, right? That's clear. And we need to make a special emphasis that even there it is ilav olu. Why might we have thought otherwise, that it's not ilav olu? Because in fact, the moir is not oir. The moir is a different category than oir. In what way is it? It's very different. The moir is the source of the light. The oir does not have a source of light of its own. So they're mamish in two different categories. Taking the example of the sun and its ray, the sun is bright through and through, but its brightness is not just a brightness that comes from elsewhere, its brightness comes from itself. It creates the brightness. How is that comparable to oil, which does not have its own source of brightness? So you may have thought that oil is ilav olu in terms of different madreges of oil. But when you talk about oil, legabe the moir, it's not ilav olu. Because in the moir, it's not oil, it's the moir. It's the source of light. Whatever it is. It's not ilav olu. Ilav olu, as we're going to explain later, means that the olu comprehends the olu, the ilah, and wants to naturally to be connected there. But it's two different worlds. This is a moir and this is a oir. So that's why the Rebbe makes the emphasis that when you talk about oir, it's always ilav olu, it's always gilui hahelem, at every level, even at the highest level when it comes from the very source of moir. Where moir itself is not oir, it's something else. But it also has the quality, inherently, the quality of oir. To give off oir. And yet, we say that it's gilui hahelem.
The only way ilav olu is if two substances are made of the same material, so to say?
Ilav olu, if you want to kind of materialize this, if they are, like I illustrated the other day, that if you take two books, you weren't here last time. Now I understand. You have to take two books and you throw this book against that one, and as a result of this one moving, this one moves. Right? So this is the cause for the movement of this one. Okay. But in this case, the movement of this one and the movement of this one is an identical phenomenon. It isn't that this one has anything more in its movement quality than this. This doesn't move on its own, and you have to push it. This doesn't move on its own. It so happened because this passed through its space, and therefore it made it move. So that would not be called ilu ve'olu. But the koyach in the hand that moves this object, you remember that? You want to finish it? Go ahead. Right. See, this object moves only when it moves. When it's standing still, it doesn't have the quality of movement. So therefore it doesn't create movement. So its movement and this movement is identical. It's not in different madrigas. But the hand has the ability to create movement because the hand can stay still and can also move. Now, the power of movement that's in the hand exists even while the hand is staying still. It's not moving. You understand? That power of movement that is there even when it is still is a different level than the power of movement of actual movement. It's a different level completely. And that's called the ilah ve'olu. When I move my arm, that's an actual movement, and that behind that is the passive power of movement, which means I can move my hand anytime I want, and that passive power is much higher in quality than the actual movement. But the actual movement actually relates back, gets its the olu from the initial power.
Movement is movement of the hand, movement of the object.
Both. I mean, main thing is movement of the hand. The object moves because my hand moves. But in my hand, the power of movement is essential. It's like a moir. You understand? It has the power of movement even while it's not moving. Okay, I'd urge you to listen to that shir because we discussed this at great length in the whole evening. So this is what the Rebbe says now, that oir coming from a moir, even though it's coming from a moir is a different category completely than oir. Yet it's correct to say that it's gilei hahelem, and it is therefore ilu ve'olu. Why? Because the definition of oir is that it reflects what the moir is. This is the meaning of oir. Like when the sun gives off light, the reason that the sun gives off light is not because it creates light. It decides to give light. But rather because its whole essence, its whole body, naturally gives off light. It's bright. In other words, oil reflects what the moir is. Since that oil reflects what the moir is, that means that the oil was inherently contained within the moir even before the oil came out. Because that's the part of the essence of the moir. So when the oil comes out, it's only megala, that which was contained before. It's not like the moir creates something different by choice. It's a reflection of what the moir is.
Light is bright and it has a connection to the brightness of the sun, which is essential. Which is the brightness of the sun of the light cannot be made by itself. The brightness in the sun is by itself, by the sun. So because we like to this aspect of the sun, which is brightness, and it's going to be included in like any. So that's the explanation. I give you this explanation now because it's reflecting the oil.
Why it's called gilei hahelem? Gilei hahelem means Oir, it means reveals that which contained inside it. Because that's essentially the sun. And therefore, it is Ilavon. In other words, the way the brightness of the sun is contained within the sun is called the Ilo. And when it comes out as Oir, that's called the Oir.
Right, but our question is that the gam was because as you see that the light is not the sun.
Oh.
So the sun is not the light. So that's what
So,
your question.
that's right. So the answer, that's what I'm explaining. That even though that the sun is something else than light,
Right.
but the union of light is a reflection of its essence.
Right.
So light relates to something that is part of the essence of the Moir,
Which is to reflect the light.
which reflects the essence
to
of
illuminate, to shine light.
right. So therefore, the Oir can understand, can relate to its source, not in terms of the source being able to create the light, but in terms of the source having brightness. The Oir understands what brightness is, and therefore it wants naturally. In a matter of speaking, the Oir should want to stay in its source, because that's where it's real. What's when real? There is the essence of the light. It can create light. Whereas the light coming out of the sun, it's only light. It doesn't have its source. Okay. Masking?
I don't get so.
What?
I don't get this whole thing so well. But I'm not gonna get it if you can explain it again. Because, I'm not getting it not because I'm just not getting it. So there's something there.
How do you know you're not going to get it? Because you're going to explain it again.
No, because it's not doesn't. I mean,
What?
It's not. I.
You can't relate to the concept.
Yeah. Right. I can. Yeah. I don't. For example, the last thing I have a question. What is the difference between this and the example was the book that.
Okay, so why don't you ask?
Yeah, but yeah. So
Mhm.
so the hand itself is also not. How is moving of the book relates to the hand which moves it? You said that we would think to say that the light is not relating to the sun. We would think to say that it's not the light is not because the sun is because the sun.
It's a different category.
Yeah, but the hand is also you said in the beginning that by definition the cause has to be of a different category than the effect. Didn't you say that?
Yes, a different category, but not a different thing. In other words, in conclusion of my discussion of the Moir, we said that the Moir per se, the fact that there is a substance, it can create light, that is a different category completely, and the Oir does not understand anything about that. But the brightness that's contained in the sun, that the Oir can relate to.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yeah.
And that brightness is very similar to the brightness in the Oir. The only difference is that that's the brightness in its source, and this is the brightness that's spread out. And that's why there is a correlationship. In terms of the koyach hayad, in the muscle of the hand movement is a much lower level than the power of the hand to move. You understand that?
But it's the same thing.
But it's the same thing.
Uh-huh. But the sun is not the same thing as the light because
The only
the sun is.
okay. Let me explain to you a little broader this the motion of the hand, and you'll be able to understand it in the sun. Okay. The hand has the power of movement inherently, right? The koyach of the hand. Even when the hand is not moving, it has the power of movement. Why does it have the power of movement?
The body is alive.
Because the body is alive. Because there's a neshama in there. Right? A neshama which is much higher than the whole union of movement. It's a different thing completely. You understand? We would not say that the movement of the hand is directly reflective of the neshama. The movement of the hand is reflective of the koyach of koyach atnuah.
Yeah. So that's how it is with the sun.
That's right.
I understand that. I understand that.
Okay. See, you have to wake up. So, you understand? You don't have to say, "Oh, I can't relate to it." That's a question.
I understand.
You understand? It doesn't. The movement of the hand, the actual movement, can relate to the koyach of movement, and there is similarity there. But you cannot directly relate it to the essence of the neshama. Whereas when we talk about the moir, that's the moir. That's the essence of the neshama, so to speak. That's a different category completely. And yet we say that even from the moir, if it's oir, it is ilavayol. Why? Because it's oir. What does oir mean? Oir means that which reflects the moir from its essence. What the essence of the moir is reflected in the oir. It's not the essence itself, but it's reflected. And that's why oir always can relate back to its source.
Koyach is the power to, is the ability to move or the actual movement?
No, the ability, koyach atnuah.
And then, so that's the ilah, and the ol is the actual movement.
Right. Clearly, when you move your hand, you were able to move your hand before you moved it.
Why gone when it's also when it's nimshach from the ma'or? From what you're saying, the light is like. So what difference does it make if when it's nimshach from the ma'or, or when it's already now shining on the bush?
That's what I explained. Because we would think otherwise.
No, but why would you think otherwise only when it's nimshach from the ma'or and not when it's?
Because at the moment when it's nimshach from the moir, it's nimshach from something that is not oir. Because the moir is the source of it. Throughout the Seder Hishtalshelus, the koyach hanefesh, this is a higher koyach, this is a lower koyach. It is not the source of life, it is an expression of life. So there are different levels of expression of life. But when you talk about the very source of life, that's a different thing completely. We would think that there's no direct relationship between the oil and the moir.
So there's a connection when a mile away, like with the lights, like a far distance, there might be a connection. That's what I'm saying.
Connection to what?
I'm saying the Rebbe is specifically speaking about
Wait
Arshim Shepin Hamar right at the point where the Mar ends, I guess, in the Ar starts.
It says even when you speak about the oil coming from the moir, surely when you talk about oil going down different madrigas, like we said, from machshava into dibur, there for sure we can more readily understand it. But he says the cloud that oil is ilah v'olu, is gilui ha'helem, is always true even the oil comes from the moir.
And later on though, in the progress of the light, you have Ilav Olive, but you don't have that part that is
Moir.
right.
That's right. So there, it's not so difficult to understand the principle that it's Ilav There is a correlation between low madrig and a high madrig. You understand? But when you go back to the very inception, that which creates the light, there it is, we need special emphasis to say that even there, the oil really pre-existed in the moir. Why do we say that? Because the principle of oil is that it reflects what the moir is. Rather than something that the moir creates, makes to be. Okay? Now you can relate to the Sinyan. I want you to know that when you understand these principles, ideas, this opens up a new world for you. It pays in the beginning to dig through and to understand the finer, in concepts, in the insights that are here. Ilav olul, oir moir, and then you have a different understanding of Chassidus. Yeah.
I'm sure about that. When you're saying that the light is relating to the essential quality of the sun, which is brightness, and therefore it's reflection of the sun, right? Right, what you said?
Yeah.
You're saying, it means that it means that it is essential quality of the sun. That's the essence of the sun. I'm asking because when you said that you would have thought otherwise, because when you're looking at the oil of only reflecting the quality of the sun, which is the brightness, so you think it's probably different things, and then you give an answer. No, it's not because it's the essential quality. Does that understand that?
Yeah. You have to understand the word essential. What do you mean by essential quality? Okay. Essential quality means that it's a reflection of what the sun is. The brightness of the sun, the brightness in the sun itself, is not an add-on, like somebody used it, an add-on. It's not an add-on. Huh? Add-on, an additional thing. It actually reflects of what the sun is. Okay. The case of the sun, I told you last time, that the union of the motion of the sun is a very narrow motion, because the sun is only a physical moir, where the sun has no choice but to give off light. The neshama, for instance, is also a moir, but it's a different level of moir. The neshama does have a choice to give off light or not to give off light. And yet, when you say it's light from the neshama, it means that when the neshama chooses to give off light, it gives off the light that reflects what it is. That's why the nefesh ho'elikis, for instance, nefesh ho'elikis has seichel. The seichel of the nefesh ho'elikis will understand only godly things. It will not be able to relate to behemish things. Why not? Seichel. Seichel is seichel because the seichel of the nefesh ho'elikis reflects what the nefesh ho'elikis is.
Okay, so you're saying that it's good enough when you see the light of the sun, which reflecting the sun's brightness, you can already say that it's the light of the sun, it's nothing else. Just like you would say about nefesh ho'elikis, for example, has a seichel. Nefesh ho'elikis, which would reflect only nefesh ho'elikis, not nefesh habahamis.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but in the sun, as I said, in the sun it's a much lower level, because the sun only has that light, doesn't have anything else. And also it has no choice to conceal it or reveal it. But there's one Indian where the sun is a good moshel, in the fact that the sun is the inception, is the originator of the light. It is a moir. That's why Wherever there is sun, there is light. But take the sun away, the light dissipates. Because the light that comes off is not a moir, it's only light. Huh? Well, the last statement?
No, I don't understand the idea of essential quality being essence.
Okay, essential quality means the following. Um, you take a piece of wood, and you look at it externally. It looks like a piece of wood. You break it. What does it look like? Like a piece of wood. You cut it into different parts. Always looks the same. A piece of wood. Why? Because it is wood through and through. It's not just wood the way it is presented. It's wood through and through. Because that's what it is. You take a piece of plastic and you give it a good paint job and it looks like wood, like these walls over here. If you go a little beyond the surface, what do you see? Totally different color completely. Why? Because it's not through and through that color. You understand? This is what we mean by essential. The brightness in the sun is through and through in the sun. It's not something that the sun creates at the external level. Okay, you want light, here it is. It is part of its essence. The sun is bright through and through. And that's why when it appears in the form of brightness.
Why don't you call the sun bright then? Why don't you call it sun?
Do
It
you
doesn't have a name to it, right?
Because it's not bright. Brightness is only the oil of the sun. The sun is the source of brightness. It creates the brightness. In other words, the essence, the substance of the sun is not brightness. The substance of the sun is whatever, is fire. That's exactly the difference. Oil only has brightness. The sun is brightness through and through, but that's not what it is in its essence, in its substance. Okay. Do I have everybody together now? Yes? Okay, sure. Let's call it Kibbutz Goliath. All right? And therefore the Rebbe says that in Ilu v'Yolu, okay, we'll start inside 4 lines from the bottom, at the end of the line. U'be'ilu v'Olu, in any situation where there's a relationship of the type called Ilah v'Olu. And again, just to repeat that Ilah is the same thing as the Olu, but on a much higher and different level, a much more substantial level. Teva ha'Olu hidovik bi'ilosei. The nature of the Olu is to cleave and to stick around its Ilah.
Is all Kilui Hayalan Ilah v'Olu?
I'm sorry?
Is all Kilui Hayalan Ilah v'Olu?
Yes. In terms of oil, yes. Because the Helen is the Ilah for the Gilui.
So is there a difference in Kilui Hayalan and Ilah v'Olu?
That's why he says no. Gilui HaHelam shehu inyan Ilah v'Olu. The Ilah is at a much higher level than the Olu, but it's of the same inyan. The Olu is only the relation, the gilui of what's contained in the ilah. And therefore the nature of olul is lidovik beilosa, to stick around the ilah. And when I first started, I give you the illustration. Now that we know what we're talking about, we understand the illustration of machshava v'dibur. That when you explain something, and the explanation, you try to make sense of it, you try to make it coherent and logical and all that. After all that, the real essence of the understanding is what you have in the machshava, not what you have in the dibur. So therefore, when you explain it, you don't rely, quote unquote, you don't trust so much the words that you explain it. The reason you're saying these words not only because they are logical, but because in machshava you understand the Indian. You follow? That's the real impetus. That's the real reason why you're explaining it. Not only because you can put it out logically and make sense of it. That illustrates the Indian that the Olul wants to stick around, but the Ilah doesn't want to go away. Because once it goes away, it loses that substance, that power of the essence of the essence of the Ilah.
If you're not thinking, you don't know what to say.
If you're not thinking, you don't know what to say. That's true. But even if you know a subject thoroughly, inside out, you know everything about it, when you speak, you want to get back into it and to understand it and to think of it, not just, oh, I know it by heart. Because even though you're going to speak, so what's the difference? You know what you're going to say. No, that's not enough.
There's never a point where you can say something without thinking.
Of course you can, but you're not very satisfied with that. And you're not sure that you said the right thing. Even if you can argue the point and make sense of it, it's not. When you really think into it, when you understand it, then you can speak about it. You made Avram laugh. Okay. The nature of the olul is to stick to the ilah. Okay, now he explains this phenomenon, this principle that I explained just now. Because ilah v'yolul are be'erech one to the other. What does be'erech mean? They understand each other. There is a similarity between them. They're not in two different worlds. V'im kein, and thus, since that they be'erech to one another, ha'olul margish asilos, therefore the olul senses and understands and feels the quality of the ilah and the superiority of the ilah and the value of the ilah. V'lozois, and thus chofetzu mishtoikek, it desires and it actually thirsts, it longs lehidovik b'yilosei, to connect and become and join the ilah, v'loy lehisrachik mimenu, not to distance from it, v'leirid lamata, and come down lamata. Because coming down lamata, he loses this special quality of the ilah. Yeah.
So also in the seichel, is there also those two qualities where you have the substance of a light, so to say, and then the brightness, and then you have the olul, which is the dibur, is the, and you might not think that's the olul.
No, but there it's not the source. The seichel, the machshava is not the source. Forget about it. This will be explained. This is from Moir and Oir. Now we're going back to the principle of ilah v'olul.
So when you say the sun, it has nothing to do with machshava and dibur. You were just speaking about the sun.
No. But we said that even in the case of the sun, it's also similar. But so it's another thing. That's all we said. That the sun. And now, okay, we put that aside. We rested at that point. Oil is always ilah v'yolu, even in the case of moed. Oil coming from the moed. Now get back to the union of ilah v'yolu. Ilah v'yolu is when the ilah and the olol are be'erech to one another. They appreciate one another. And if they appreciate one another, the olol wants to stick to the ilah. Because that's where its real source and its real essence is. That's where the union that it represents, what the olol represents, has real substance, has real base and truth.
You don't want to explain it.
Well, we will see about the fact whether you want to explain it or not. That's what the whole discussion is about. All I'm illustrating is that the Olul wants to, tends to be relating back to the Ilah. It doesn't tend to be separating, but relating back.
But then you said that when you speak it, then you actually get what
Machshava.
you get back. You get back what you're not kind of separating from it. You get the actual.
Right. Why? Because you want to stick to it, because that's where the essence of the seichel is.
That's the answer already. Why? How come that it actually
Wants to
how it
be.
comes down? It should have been stayed.
The question is, it should, right, you're right. The question is, since it gets life from that, and it appreciates that, or Elo, it appreciates it, really understands it, why does it want to go down? It doesn't want to go down. It shouldn't want to go down. Because logically it should want to stay to its source. Because that's where its own inyan is much more substantive. Much more true. Okay. Okay, gentlemen.